Worry about your child's maths progress doesn't usually arrive all of a sudden in a flash of panic. It's more like a little niggle that doesn't quite go away. You're happily getting on with your day, and then you notice your child struggling with something you didn't expect, or something isn't sticking despite that extra support. And there's that niggle again. In this episode, I want to take the time to explore what you might do when you have worries about your child's maths. Not to add to them, but because I think if we look at it properly, it stops being something that just sits there weighing you down and starts being something you can actually do something with. Welcome to Safety in Numbers, a podcast for parents of children who struggle with maths, including those with dyscalculia or a specific learning difficulty in maths. In each episode, we explore what might be happening when maths feels difficult and what parents can do to better understand and support their child. Your worries are likely to have shown up over time. Perhaps you've begun to notice your child finding maths harder than you would have expected. You may have noticed that they're not grasping things as easily as you'd have thought that they might, even with extra help from you, a tutor, or school. You've begun to notice the same pattern coming round again, their confusion, forgetting, perhaps some distress. And alongside all of that noticing, that niggle starts building. Maybe you're asking yourself if they'll grow out of this, or if it's something that you need to do something about. A parent said something to me once that I think quite a bit about. She said, I didn't feel panicked exactly, but she did feel like she was waiting to find out whether her daughter's difficulties were going to resolve on their own or whether they weren't. That waiting without clarity or understanding of what might be going on often feels really uncomfortable because you don't want to overreact, but you also don't want to look back and wish you'd paid attention sooner. So let's start with what worry is actually doing here. When you say you're worried, you're not usually describing anxiety. You're describing something that's grabbed your attention. You're noticing that something doesn't quite make sense. Your child is capable, they're articulate, they're doing well in plenty of other areas, and yet maths feels unexpectedly hard in a way that isn't moving on the way you'd expect it to. Now, that mismatch is worth paying attention to. Parents can get pushed toward one of two extremes here, either one of reassurance, don't worry, they'll catch up, or one of escalation, you need to get this assessed straight away. But most parents are actually sitting somewhere in between, not unconcerned, but not certain either. And what really helps when you're in that in-between place isn't being pushed to make a decision. It's having the clarity about what's going on for your child. Here's the difficulty. In the early stages, you're unlikely to tell the difference between perhaps a gap in their learning and a deeper difficulty. Both look almost identical from the outside. That forgetting, the confusion, needing the same thing explained more than once. There's no obvious marker that tells you which one you're looking at. And the thing with maths itself that doesn't help you here is that maths builds on itself. Each new topic builds on the one before it. So something that wasn't quite secure 6 months ago doesn't necessarily show up straight away. It can sit there, apparently fine, and then resurface later when your child hits something that depends on it. Most of the time, a wobble is just a wobble. A child finds fractions hard or multiplication tricky for a short time, and then it clicks and they move on. That's ordinary learning. It doesn't mean anything more is going on. But the two situations only really separate themselves over time. A gap tends to respond with the right explanation and enough opportunity to practice. A child begins to understand and can use what they have learned more reliably. A deeper difficulty tends to persist even when the child has had clear teaching, repeated explanation, and plenty of practice. I worked with a boy whose parents had been told that he needed more practice. They gave him that support consistently and patiently over a long period of time. But when I met him, he was still finding the same aspects of maths difficult. At that point, simply increasing the amount of practice was unlikely to help. The important question was whether he understood the maths he was being asked to practice and whether he needed a different way of learning it. He may have needed more practical equipment, smaller steps, clearer links between ideas, or support with an underlying difficulty such as understanding quantity or remembering procedures. More practice can help when a child is still learning something. But when the same difficulty continues despite clear teaching and repeated practice, it is important to look more closely at why. So let's say that niggle hasn't gone away. What is it actually pointing you toward? There are a few patterns that over time become notable, and I want to talk you through them. The first is persistence. And by that, I don't mean a difficulty that shows up a few weeks and then fades, because that's what ordinary learning is all about, because learning isn't linear. There are peaks and troughs, and most children experience those. I mean something that's been going on for a long time, not days or weeks, but months or longer. And that doesn't really shift even as time passes and teaching continues. Parents sometimes describe it as going around in circles. Your child seems to understand something for a while. They might even appear to have got it. And then the same difficulty turns up again later, sometimes in a slightly different form, sometimes in exactly the same way. This isn't about lack of input. There may have been extra explanation, targeted support at school, careful work at home, and despite all of that, the difficulty doesn't move the way you'd reasonably expect it to. The second is inconsistency. Not the ordinary ups and downs, a tired day, an off day, needing a reminder now and again. I mean when your child seems to understand something one day and they can explain it back to you. They work through an example and it looks like it's clicked, but then the next day it's gone, dropped away entirely, as though you're starting from scratch. I've talked earlier in the series about understanding, not consolidating overnight. For most children, once something's really been grasped, it tends to settle in long-term memory with sleep and repetition. When this happens repeatedly, it suggests that your child may look as though they are following the maths during a lesson or explanation, but is struggling to remember and use it later. That's different from simply needing an occasional reminder. It may mean that the child needs the idea to be taught in a different way, for example, with practical resources, smaller steps, and clearer links to what they already understand, before practice is likely to be useful. The third is effort. And I mean genuine effort. Your child is listening, engaging, having a go, and sticking with it, even when it's hard. If they're doing all of that and still not making the progress you'd expect, that's something to really pay attention to. Effort usually does pay off in learning. When it doesn't, it's not telling you something about their motivation or attitude. It's telling you something about how their learning itself is being processed. This is often the hardest pattern for parents because it's difficult watching your child try so hard and still come up against a wall. It's usually the point where the question shifts from are they trying to why isn't this sticking? And the fourth and final one for this episode is your child's emotional response. Difficulty in maths doesn't just stay in the maths lesson or the homework sheet. Over time, it starts to feed into how a child understands themselves. If maths is beginning to affect how your child feels, dread before a lesson, avoidance, frustration, distress, that matters just as much as what they can or can't do with the maths task itself. I worked with a girl once who on paper looked like she was making slow but steady progress. If you'd looked at her books in isolation, you probably wouldn't have been particularly concerned. The work was neat enough. There were ticks on the page, so it appeared she was getting things right. So it seemed that she understood what she was being taught. But when I spoke with her, she said something that really made me take note. She said, "I think everyone else understands maths and I don't." This told me something important because the difficulty wasn't showing up in her books. It had turned into something she believed about herself, that everyone else was managing maths and she wasn't. She was carrying that belief of herself and others inside. And that's not something we want to leave unexamined because what children come to believe about themselves as learners shapes how they approach every challenge afterwards, long after a particular maths topic is behind them. So, given all of that, what do you actually do with it? The first thing is that you don't need to do anything with your concerns straight away. It's not a question that needs a quick decision. It's something you can observe over time with a bit more structure than "I've just got a bad feeling about this." Start noticing more deliberately. When does the difficulty show up? Is it consistent across maths topics or school subjects, or does it vary? Does your child cope better in some contexts than others? Notice what seems to help, even slightly, and what doesn't. It's worth having a conversation with your child's teacher, not to look for reassurance, but to compare notes. What are they seeing in the classroom? Does what they see in the classroom match what you're seeing at home? Are there particular areas where it's more noticeable? Now, here's something I want to be incredibly clear about because a lot of parents are caught out by this. If the teacher says they haven't noticed anything or that everything seems fine, that does not mean that your concerns are not valid. A classroom of 30 children moves fast, and a child can appear to be getting by. They can copy a method off the board, follow the child next to them, and give enough right answers, often enough not to stand out, all the while still not actually understanding what they are doing. What you're seeing at home, one-to-one, without the noise and the pace of a full class, can be a much clearer picture than what's visible from the front of a classroom. So take the "everything's fine" as one piece of information, not the final word. Your observations at home haven't been contradicted, they've just come from a different vantage point. The second is to shift from judgment to observation. And I want to develop this one properly because I think it's the most important thing in this whole episode. Instead of asking, "Is my child bad at maths?" or even, "Should I be worried?" try asking, "What am I actually seeing and how consistent is it?" Those two angles of the question feel similar, but they send you off in completely different directions. A verdict question, "Is my child bad at maths? Is something wrong with them?" has nowhere to go except towards an answer about your child, about who they are. And children are remarkably good at absorbing the tone of a question, even when it's never asked directly to them. If the atmosphere around maths in your house is, "We're trying to work out if there's a problem with you," that can land internally for your child, whether you mean it to or not. But observation-based questions like, "What am I actually seeing? How consistent is it? When do I see it?" have somewhere useful to go. They give you information. They give you a pattern you can describe to a teacher or an assessor, or simply use to decide what to try next. It keeps the difficulty as something your child is experiencing rather than something your child is. The third is to keep your child's experience central alongside what they can or can't do. It would be easy to think that how a child feels about maths is a secondary concern, something to worry about once the actual issue with maths is sorted. But it doesn't work that way around. If your child is beginning to feel like they can't do it, or that they're not as good as other people, or don't understand why maths is so hard for them, those beliefs don't only stay attached to maths. Carol Dweck's work on mindset and Joe Bowler's application of it in maths helps explain how children can begin to believe that they are simply not a maths person. That belief may develop after repeated experiences of finding maths difficult. Once it becomes established, a child may avoid maths, give up more quickly, or approach new work already expecting to fail. So this isn't a side issue to attend to once the academic picture is clearer. It's often the thing that determines whether your child stays open to help at all, and it's something we'll come back to properly in a future episode. And the fourth is this. You don't have to deal with all of this on your own. If your child attends a school, school should be part of the conversation. Now, I want to be fair to schools here because I don't think it's as straightforward as your teacher should have spotted this. Dyscalculia and math-specific learning difficulties are still a genuinely underdeveloped area in most teacher training. I do a fair amount of work in schools helping staff build their understanding of this, and I can tell you honestly that most schools I go into are starting from a fairly low base. Not through any lack of care, but because it simply hasn't been a strong feature of how teachers are trained. So if your child's school seems unsure or hasn't got a clear process for this, it's not a clear reflection on what they think of your child. It's a reflection of a training gap that's only recently starting to be acknowledged. That said, if over time the pattern becomes clearer, if the difficulty is persistent, significant, and not resolving, then exploring it more formally isn't overreacting. It's responding appropriately to what you're seeing. Not to label your child unnecessarily, but to understand them more precisely. Because once something is understood clearly, it can be responded to more effectively. In episode 10 of this season, I'll be talking about what support to expect from school, and this idea is covered in more detail then. I want to say something here because a parent said this to me recently in my Facebook parent support group, and I think about it often. She said she didn't want to be one of those pushy parents. I understand why she said it. None of us want to be the parent the school dreads speaking to. But asking questions about your child's education is not being pushy. It's not something to apologize for. There's a real difference between how you go about it. There are more effective and less effective ways of raising a concern, and a good working relationship with school is important. But the act of asking, of wanting to understand what's going on for your child and advocating for them is not a character flaw. It's what you're supposed to do. You are allowed to ask questions. You are allowed to keep asking until you actually understand what's going on. I'll put an episode together at some stage specifically about how you might effectively speak with school. If I had to leave you with one idea, it's this. Clarity is more useful than worry. Worry asks, is something wrong? Clarity asks, what is actually happening here? And that shift changes what happens next, because once you understand the pattern more clearly, you can respond in a way that fits your child. I've put together a short companion guide for this episode to help you turn what I've talked about today into something you can use, a way of noticing what's persistent, what's shifting, and what might be worth exploring further. You can find a link to it in the show notes. See you next time.